It's a tradition at my house every Halloween to just crank through a bunch of sitcom Halloween specials to get everyone in the spooky mood. And last year, one of the best ones we watched was season 3, episode 5 of Community, titled Horror Fiction in 7 Spooky Steps. Now, the premise of the episode is that Britta got everyone to fill out a personality test, and from it she learned that somebody in the study group has homicidal tendencies. And for the rest of the episode, she plans to uncover who that psychopath may be by getting everyone to tell ghost stories, with the hopes that this activity will reveal very clearly that one person has a darker mind than everyone else. And in this video, I'm going to be breaking down each person's story and discussing what it shows about them as a person, starting with...
I think I heard something.
It's just the sound of my heart, baby.
Britta's story is intended to be something of a modern slasher movie. It features this hookman monster who returns later in the episode and is very obviously meant to be like Jason or Michael Myers or whatever. Apparently the hookman is a real piece of folklore who is known for attacking couples making out in cars. And while the symbolism behind it can have many different interpretations, there's two popular ones that I find very compelling. One is that the hookman is someone who disapproves of sexual experimentation in young couples, either because they're like an authoritative parent or they're someone who's sexually repressed themselves. And those ideas apply here because Britta chose to make herself and Jeff the couple that gets attacked. The two of them have a very complicated romantic history, and Britta maybe feels bitter that the group, or maybe Annie specifically, is keeping them apart, so Britta subconsciously positions them to be the villain. Another interpretation is that the monster's hand being amputated is a symbol for castration, once again linking back to sexual repression, and the choice to place a hook on top of it is sort of a vengeful form of phallic imagery, which reminded me quite a lot of the drill villain in Slumber Party Massacre. Now, while that film is very different from this, I do think it's interesting that Slumber Party Massacre positions toxic male partners as the villain, and in Britta's story, she is also very critical of the boyfriend character she created.
Fine, I'll get out and look. But then I'm entitled to sex.
This probably links back to how Britta is upset about the way Jeff has been treating her in their relationship, and Britta making her own character the one that was right all along shows off her ego, which is evidence for why she's revealed to be one of the psychopaths at the end of the episode. Also, because Britta is the most liberal character, it makes sense that her villain is something of a conservative authority. Britta's story is filled with cliches, half as a way to parody slashers, and half because she's rushing through it since she's only really telling the story to see what each character's reaction is. The fact that she's so proactive with her psychoanalytical detective work shows that she thinks of herself very highly as a psychologist, which is once again an example of her ego, and in turn evidence that she could be homicidal.
I'm turned on by how logical you are.
I'm comforted by your shiny hair and facial symmetry.
Instead of focusing on the horrors that take place in Britta's story, Abed focuses on Britta's bad writing. He claims that her story is cliche, the characters are too dumb, and their deaths aren't earned. So Abed chooses to remake Britta's story, but with him as the lead instead of idiot Jeff. And then his whole story is basically a very funny parody where the characters in it are comically responsible and safe, and they basically do the opposite of everything you'd expect to see in a slasher. We will soon see that Abed's story is arguably the only one that doesn't feature any self-aggrandizing or coping mechanisms or villainizing certain ideas. Instead, he only cares about the quality of the story. And that makes sense for him, as he's always looking out towards media because of his Asperger's rather than being in his own head. Also, due to his Asperger's, his story shows that he has no real idea how people interact or how romantic relationships work.
I love you.
Around Abed's story, the group discussed the idea of whether certain people deserve to die. And while I don't believe any of these characters would actually be homicidal, it's interesting that Abed's story is the only one which doesn't feature any violence. And I think the victims of violence in other people's stories is very revealing about how the storyteller thinks.
Stifle your slacking maw, you drained and tainted bitch dog.
Annie's story is a Twilight, Beauty and the Beast fusion, which makes sense because she likely grew up with the Disney Renaissance, and Twilight during the early 2010s was the lowest hanging fruit for comedy shows to parody. At the start of the story, Annie positions herself as a damsel in distress, who's swept off her feet by a very misogynistic vampire played by Jeff. Their honeymoon phase lasts about 10 seconds as it's revealed that Jeff needs to suck on blood to stay alive, and that he keeps Britta in his closet whenever he needs a new dose. This is a very obvious allegory for men using women for their sexual needs, and for Annie's jealousy of Jeff's relationship with Britta. Despite Vampire Jeff's metaphorical promiscuity, Annie stays with Jeff and teaches him how to read. This links into that thing of people being so in love with the idea of their partner that they brush aside any red flags and instead say, I can fix them, when in reality you can't force change like that. But Annie tries, and I think the choice of self-improvement being learning how to read, kind of shows how low Annie has the bar for Jeff. Eventually, Jeff ends up being able to read a quote from King Lear about how humans want too much. Maybe a symbol for Annie wanting her perfect Jeff, or how Jeff's multiple romantic partners seems excessive to Annie. The story takes a twist though, because Annie suddenly becomes a werewolf and kills Jeff. This is her way of getting vengeance over all the ways Jeff did her wrong over the course of the show. And it's interesting how in season 2's Halloween special she's Little Red Riding Hood, but here she's a big bad wolf. This could be seen either as a symbol for her character development, or it could be a symbol for how over the course of the year, her true colors had been revealed to the viewers, and her true colors are surprisingly brutal. Troy's story is about two awesome pilots that get experimented on by a mad scientist and become conjoined with psychic powers. They then get revenge on the scientist. I've seen people claim that this is homoerotic because Troy and Abed like wake up together and have to be together for life and they're not against that idea, which is such a reach. I feel like this story is mainly just showing off how childish Troy is, because this story isn't really scary, it's more of an action sci-fi sort of thing where he gets to live in a world that he thinks is awesome with his best friend. It's tonally a lot like Captain Underpants or the comic books I used to make when I was 10, because it features very dumb plot logic and absurdist humor. It is quite odd how his story focuses on body mutilation, because I don't necessarily think there's anything in Troy's character which that could represent. I feel like it's mainly just an example of Troy being so in his own world that he thinks something that horrific would be awesome. However, either way, self-mutilation is apparently often seen as a psychotic solution to personal problems, so I guess it makes sense why Troy ends up being one of the homicidal people.
This is a home invasion, you jive mother!
This one is just ridiculous. Pierce portrays himself as a Hugh Hefner type whose home gets invaded by very racist portrayals of gangsters. He then proceeds to beat them up with his wood. This story is nothing more than Pierce trying to make himself look cool and young again, and along the way he shows off his misogyny with the way the women are portrayed, and he shows off his racism with the way he makes his monster a black home invader. He chooses to cast Troy as the part to a large degree out of racism, but also it's an act of revenge because Troy made Pierce the villain in his story. Troy and Pierce are apparently friends, but the toxicity of their relationship is very evident in season 3. I mean, Pierce was similarly petty and vengeful in the episode right before this one. Also, the fact that Pierce chose to fix the conflict with his penis just speaks for itself. Shirley's horror story has roots in apocalyptic tales from the Middle Age. It focuses on a group of youths being punished by God on Judgment Day, and I think the funniest part of it is how bad Shirley's understanding of young adults is. Oh yeah, also the Dean as the devil is intense. Shirley then appears as an angel, and at first the characters believe that they're going to be saved, but instead Shirley just says, "I forgive you," and then leaves them to suffer, which is very obviously the writers highlighting how they believe Christianity has a lot of hypocrisy and empty statements to it. Shirley's story, like Pierce's, features a lot of on-the-nose wish fulfillment. She wants to believe that her devoting her life to Christianity was worthwhile, and she wants the study group to be punished for making fun of her. The monster in her story is the devil, which makes sense, but she chooses to make the victims rebellious young adults, which shows that to some degree, Shirley believes that demographic deserves punishment.
Somebody please give me a hug.
Get in here.
After Britta tells the study group about the test situation, the room becomes chaos, so Jeff steps in with his story to save the day. His story features the study group hanging out at Christmas, and the Hookman barges in. Jeff asks the Hookman why he kills people, and he responds with,
Fear? I kill because I'm afraid.
and then they hug it out. This, in my opinion, is an example of Jeff saying something that he doesn't really believe just to fix a situation, something he does time and time again because of his manipulative lawyer experience.
Fear. Anchovies. Fear.
However, it's hard not to buy into the wholesomeness of what he's saying. The Christmas setting shows how everything that Halloween stands for eventually washes away, and how in the coldest times people are able to come together for warmth and joy. And the whole thing of killers killing because they're afraid, while hokey, does apply to this episode, because almost every horrific act within the story came from the storyteller's own personal frustration, struggles, vendettas, and paranoia.
Anyone here could be a psycho!
Thinking that is what psycho.
So the conclusion of the episode is that Britta messed up the scanning of the test, and it turns out everyone except Abed has homicidal potential, which makes sense since his story shows that he's the least narcissistic and vengeful character. What a great time this was. I think what sets apart a good, ambitious community episode from a bad one is that for it to not feel gimmicky, the creative ideas have to come from a place of character, rather than just doing something crazy for the sake of it. And honestly, I think there's very few episodes in the show that explore how each character thinks better than this one. Thanks for watching.
Troy and Abed in the